Okay. Hi guys, so my topic was gun control. Let me see, if you guys remember 2 or 3 weeks ago, Blake gave an amazing presentation on against gun control. So my refutation is supposed to be, well, for gun control. Blake's major claim was gun control will fail to benefit society. Although I'm not actually for gun control, I believe that there's some errors with his secondary claims. Each one of his claims goes like this. Number 1, crime will increase if firearms are restricted. Number 2, criminals will never listen to firearm restriction laws. And number 3, guns often stop crimes. So, start from number 1. Crimes will increase if firearms are restricted. One of his subpoints was the reason why crime went up in the UK in 1997 was because criminals knew that people would not have firearms to defend. I found this point just a little bit weak among his many other points, just for the fact, based on the fact that it's quite a far-fetched conclusion. I believe that there could possibly be many other factors, whether that be foreign factor, political, or domestic. So it does not actually prove actual evidence, but like a survey from criminals stating that this is true rather than just a statistic, even though that it does point to this fact. He also goes on to state how when they banned guns, gun crime went down, but violent crimes went up. And he talked about how the U.S. being #1 in gun ownership has a violent crime rate of 466 per 100,000 residents. However, if we look at these violent crimes, many of them, well, not many of them, a few of them are actually domestic homicide cases. And in 2011, 1,509 women, and this is just women, domestic is, it goes both ways, by a male that they knew. 61% of these instances were actually by their spouses or their boyfriends, which came out to be 926 women, and 51% of these women that were murdered, 51% was actually with a gun that the male owned, which came out to be 796 women. So I thought that was an interesting idea to bring up. Number 2, his secondary claim, criminals will never listen to firearm restriction laws. His subpoint was, most mass shootings involve illegal high-capacity magazines, which include Sandy Hook, Aurora, and Columbine. I'm afraid to say that I did a little bit of research, and these are actually wrong. Adam Lanza, which was involved in he was a shooter in the Sandy Hook, he obtained his weapons from his mother, who was Nancy Lanza. Reportedly, she was a gun enthusiast. His Bushmaster semi-automatic rifle and his 9mm that he took from his mother were completely legal, that she purchased and that he could have purchased himself. There were no high-cap rounds used. Adam Lanza was also reported to have Asperger's. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold from the Columbine shooting, the 2 shootings that were at the high school, they also received their guns legally through a friend and through a connection that they had, who also obtained that gun legally. I believe they used a 12-gauge shotgun, a semi-automatic rifle, and 2 pistols, a 6-hour and a Glock. These are not, in fact, illegal weapons. There were no high-capacity rounds used. Everything was legal, everything was purchased for, paid for by them. And lastly, James Egan Holmes, although he did use high-capacity rounds, I do want to make the point that he did obtain the majority of his tactical gear, his ingredients for his explosives, and his weapons legally that he purchased himself. Lastly, another subpoint would be criminals will always be able to get guns. I believe that this could vary because I think the majority of crimes are, actually small instances, muggings, robberies, at gunpoint. So I believe that these small town thugs don't really have the means nor the money to acquire high-cap magazines or illegal firearms. In fact, each one of the shootings from Sandy Hook, Aurora, and Columbine, I won't go into detail, but these shooters were actually pretty well off. Let's see, James Egan Holmes was a PhD student who went to a medical university near Aurora. Adam Lanza lived in a large colonial home with his mother, Nancy Lanza. Her husband was the executive of GE, who she filed for the divorce later. So the reason I brought this up is that they were well off. Why not spend the money to purchase legal weapons? That would be much more lethal. Let's see. I'd like to make the point that maybe had gun control been enforced, some of these instances may not have occurred, judging by the fact that they all obtained these guns legally. I believe that the gun control would probably definitely affect the majority of crimes, simply because it renders them almost completely unable to obtain firearms, let alone high-capacity rounds, which 2 of the 3 shootings did not use. Lastly, his last point would be guns often stop crimes. His sub-points being focused primarily around concealed weapons, carry permit people. His 2 points were CCW holders are often able to stop crime as soon as they start, and on average, when the CCW holders stop a shooting, there's an average of 2.3 deaths. When police stop a shooting, there's an average of 14.3 deaths. I'd like to point out that CCWs are not typically your average citizen. They just don't go out handing concealed weapons, carry permits to just anyone on the streets. In fact, you have to have a full-on FBI investigation that is usually months long prior to your application process. You also have to have a series of training, safety, and test courses. This does include obstacle courses, eligibility to shoot. So I'd like to bring up the fact that should these individuals not already be considered a line of law enforcement entitled for the purchase and possession of said restricted firearms, especially if they're certified to conceal it in public, I believe. The reason I say that they should be considered a line of law enforcement is because they do take the same courses, same safety courses, same obstacle courses as military, security guards, the majority of line of law enforcement, etc. I also should bring in a little bit of the context that they said that there's an average of 2.3 deaths, police stop a shooting, there's an average of 14.3 deaths. In fact, the casualty rate for officers is quite high. So when officers do engage in a shooting, they do have to, I believe it's policy, they have to request backup. Backup usually entails multiple squad cars, and including higher forces that are on the way. So I believe that it could lead to more targets, as it is a fact that cops do get shot a lot on the job. I believe that's it. I believe that's it for my speech. So.
All right, William, you're right. You don't have to take the opposite position. You're not obligated to take, the opposite conclusion that we need to have gun control. That's not required of you. And I think you explained from the beginning that you're going to point out some flaws in the advocate's reasoning, and that's okay. But you also have to put it in the context of what their claims are. And I think that you miss that point sometimes. So you pick at some of the information that the advocate uses. You maybe suggest another way of looking at the information, or challenge the information in some way without telling us, well, how does that affect the claim that the advocate is making? If you are correct on the point that you are making, does that mean that the advocate's point is unreliable, that it in fact doesn't reach the conclusion that the advocate is talking about? You need to explain that a little bit more. The argument, for instance, about the challenge on the UK and the evidence that the advocate used from that, I mean, you basically assert the other relationships. You don't provide any evidence to support that claim. You make a suggestion that there have got to be other explanations without telling us what those other explanations would be and providing any evidence on them. When the advocate has provided evidence to support their position and you're giving an assertion in response, you better have a good explanation of your argument in order to undermine that point. But even if, we're back to the same issue, even if that's correct, does that mean that the advocate is correct that the absence of guns leads to the increased violent crime? And I think that that's a legitimate place to press on this. And you basically come down to some challenges on the violent crime rate. When you talk about the U.S. comparison, I think that's okay. If you're talking about the U.S. comparison, you mentioned domestic violence. Why is it that you're focusing on domestic violence? And I think it's because the idea here is that people would have access to guns, and so our crime rate would be much lower if we didn't, or our violent crime would be lower if people didn't have access to their own guns in the house. When they get angry or fight with their spouse or whatever it is, and they start shooting each other. I guess that's the implication that you're making there that applies to the argument. But like I said, that's one of the things that's missing from the arguments is that you've got these issues that you bring up, but you're not explaining how they undermine the advocate's position. And that's what you need to do a lot more in your arguments. I did think that you signposted the points as you went through the speech pretty well. You've got this long challenge on the high-capacity magazines, and I appreciate the detail that you went into on the individual cases. I think that those are good, but we're back to the same issue. So, does that mean that because they didn't use high-capacity magazines in most of those cases, that gun restrictions would not work? I'm not sure how the advocate reached that particular conclusion, and I'm not sure how your response addresses that particular conclusion. I just know that in 2 of the 3 cases that got mentioned, they didn't use high-capacity magazines, and in the one case where they did, we had kind of an unusual situation here. And then you're tying the argument into whether they are wealthy or they have the ability to do this, and whether or not they're using legal or illegal. And again, I don't know how that argument fits in. Does it matter whether it's legal or illegal if the advocate is saying that they were... I think it hurts you if you're saying that these were all legally obtained, then that seems to suggest that gun control laws might have helped. That's the way to maybe go with this argument and make the claim that way. In other words, and he says when there aren't any restrictions, we have fewer problems. But here are places where there weren't restrictions. I'm getting information, and I'm not sure how I'm supposed to apply the information. And you need to be a lot clearer on that. And the CCW issue, you assert, for instance, that a whole bunch of training is required in order to get the CCWs. I don't know where your information comes from. I don't know what CCW rules you're applying this to, and I didn't hear a source citation on any of that. I can tell you that in a number of states, you don't have to do jack except go in and ask for it. And as long as you aren't a criminal, they have a shall issue policy. In other words, you have to have a reason not to issue it as opposed to a reason to issue it. In California, you have to have a reason. You can't get a CCW like you're talking about. You have to go through all this training and stuff to be able to do that in California. But in Texas or Arizona or Idaho or places that have these CCW laws, you just have to go in and sign. And then you've got the right to do that. So I'm not sure that your argument applies here, and you need the evidence to back that up. All right. Thank you.